My name is David, and I have two stories to share. They're connected, and I believe both of them deserve to be heard. Years ago, I worked the late-night shift at a gas station and convenience store in the middle of nowhere. This was a long time ago, before every place had modern security systems and cameras watching every inch of the property. Security systems did exist, but they weren't a priority back then. On top of that, the owner was extremely cheap. Honestly, I didn't mind. The job itself was ridiculously easy. The hardest part was the owner. He genuinely had the memory of a goldfish. We had the same two arguments several times a week, and every time it felt like he had completely forgotten the previous conversation. He'd repeat the same points, bring up the same issues, and act like we'd never talked about it before. But here's the important part. Most nights, it was just me working alone from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and the store barely saw any customers. One night, I'm pretty sure it was a weekday, I was doing what I always did. I was leaning against the counter with a magazine, trying to stay awake and fight the boredom. It was very late. I don't remember the exact time, because when you work nights like that, all those awful hours blur together into one long, miserable stretch. The store was completely silent. The only sound was the faint buzzing of the old fluorescent lights, the kind you stop noticing after a while. I'd completely stopped noticing it, which is probably why I jumped when the front door chimed. I looked up and saw a man walking in. He was tall, black, looked to be in his early 30s, and had an above-average build. My first thought was that he might be a former athlete. But then I actually looked at him. And that's when everything felt wrong. He was completely covered in blood. At least that's what it looked like. For a brief moment, my brain tried to convince me it might be red paint, but I knew it wasn't. There was a massive splatter across his chest, streaks on his face, and smears all over his arms. It was an unreal, almost cartoonish amount of blood. That's why it took my brain so long to process it. It didn't fit anything I'd ever experienced before, and my mind froze trying to make sense of it. But what really terrified me were his eyes. They were empty. That's the only way I can describe them. There was nothing behind them at all. He looked completely normal otherwise, calm, relaxed, almost bored, like he was just walking into a gas station at 2 a.m. on any normal night. It was as if he didn't even realize he was drenched in blood. I'm explaining all of this in detail so my reaction makes sense. I don't want to sound weak or dramatic. This was genuinely horrifying. I was frozen in place, unable to move, and all I could do was stare at him. Every time I forced myself to look away, my eyes snapped right back to his face. He noticed, obviously. I was staring at him. Then he smiled, and in the calmest voice imaginable, he said, "Don't worry, it's not my blood." That didn't make me feel better, not even close. My brain immediately went into panic mode. This man had killed someone. That was my only thought. And now he was standing in front of me. I was convinced I might be next. But then survival instincts kicked in. I acted like everything was normal. I nodded at him like he just made a casual comment about the weather, and I buried my face back into the magazine. He walked through the aisles like nothing was wrong. He grabbed a few random items and brought them to the counter. I was honestly surprised he didn't just steal them. I probably would have let him. I rang him up at the register, careful not to look him in the eyes. He paid in cash, said nothing else, and walked out. The door chimed, and he was gone. As soon as I heard a car start in the parking lot, I grabbed the phone and called 911. I told them exactly what I had seen and described the man as clearly as I could. I didn't know what had happened, but I was absolutely sure that something terrible had. The dispatcher was asking follow-up questions when everything went wrong. I was mid-sentence when the door chimed again. It wasn't another customer. It was him. He came back in, and this time he looked furious. I hung up immediately, but it was too late. He knew. He must have seen me through the window. He rushed up to the counter, demanding to know if I had called the police. I denied it, but he didn't believe me, not at all. He started yelling, cursing at me, telling me to mind my own business. I raised my hands and tried to calm him down, but it didn't matter. His voice got louder, and those empty eyes were suddenly filled with rage. Before I could react, he launched himself over the counter. He didn't climb, he jumped. In seconds, he had tackled me to the ground and was strangling me. I thought I was going to die. I fought with everything I had, kicking, scratching, biting, anything to survive. I could feel blood smearing all over me as we struggled. I was desperate. Finally, I screamed that I had a gun, and I wasn't afraid to use it. It was a complete bluff, but it worked. He stopped, scrambled away from me, and ran out of the store. Moments later, I heard his car speeding off. I stayed on the floor for a long time, shaking, covered in blood. The police arrived about 10 minutes later. When they saw the state I was in, they immediately left to search for him. I never heard from them again. There was no news coverage, nothing. That was the most terrifying physical experience of my life. But the second one was worse. A few months later, I was still working at the same gas station. That was probably my first mistake. I needed the money, and I convinced myself the first incident was a one-time thing. One night, another man walked in. He immediately caught my attention because he was wearing a suit. Not just any suit. It was dark gray, perfectly tailored, and clearly expensive. He had no business being in a gas station past midnight dressed like that. He didn't browse the store. He walked straight up to me, reached into his jacket, and pulled out a photograph. It was him, the blood-covered man. The photo wasn't very clear, but I knew it was the same person. I tried to hide my reaction, but I don't think I succeeded. The man watched me silently, studying my face. After a long pause, he asked if I had ever seen that man before. I said no. It felt like the only safe answer. He stared at me for a long time. Then he picked up the photograph and turned to leave. Just before opening the door, he turned back and said, "I know you're lying." Then he was gone. Weeks later, I started seeing the same silver SUV everywhere. Near work, at the grocery store, on my street. Then one night, glass shattered in my house. I ran out and found a rock sitting on the floor. That's when I quit my job and moved. I never found out the truth. 8 months ago, something else happened.